Now, recent years have seen a huge wave of political participation going all the way from the ballot box to the streets. So from things like the Occupy movement, Tahrir Square, to what we've seen recently in Kiev. Now, although we've seen a lot of political participation, there's also been a lot of disillusionment. A lot of people don't understand how they can participate in the political process, how they can get involved in activism. So we're fortunate today to have with us as our guest Catherine Heseltine. So if you don't know Catherine, Catherine is a board member and former CEO of MPAC UK, that's the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, which is a Muslim lobby group and civil rights group. And she'll tell you a little bit more about that, I'm sure. So Catherine's been involved in political and media activism for over a decade now. She's also a primary school teacher. And she's been involved in issues ranging from civil liberties, Islamophobia, foreign policy. So can we have a round of applause to welcome Catherine?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Okay, well, I mean, the theme of tonight's talk, be the change. And I'm sure, everyone in this room wants change, things in the world that we all look at and that we want to make better. And I believe that all of us need to be involved in political change. I'm sure this is the kind of audience where a lot of people are involved in trying to make change on different scales in different ways already. So I'm really glad that we've got an opportunity later for Q&A and discussion, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who've got valuable contributions as well to make. But what I want to do is share my experiences over the past decade. What I feel we can take out of that, and I would argue that any kind of change that we want to see ultimately has a political element, comes back to politics. Now, a lot of people are instantly cynical when they hear the word politics. It just conjures up that image of a bunch of grey men in grey suits shouting at each other across the House of Commons. And I want to make very clear from the outset, I'm not talking about a kind of narrow party political sense of politics. It's the widest sense of the world. It involves everything, everything to do with media, activism, anything in the public sphere that's to do with how we organise ourselves, both on a local, national, international scale. So politics is something that affects all of us. Again, that cynicism, I think, maybe if I start with a reflection of one of my earliest political memories. Oops, no, I'm not that young. Earliest political memories. It's obviously back in when Nelson Mandela was released from jail. I was only 11 years old when that happened, so I didn't fully realise the extent of the momentous change that represented until later, when I read more about apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement. But I think it really shows. If I read a quote, from just a few years earlier, in 1987, from Margaret Thatcher, who at that point described the ANC as a typical terrorist organisation. Anyone who thinks it is going to run the government is living in cloud cuckoo land. So this wasn't just some predictable thing that was going to happen. This was, whatever you can say about South Africa and the imperfections of victory, a huge momentous change, which was one of the hard work, the sweat, the dedication, and the sacrifice of ordinary people. So again, but the earliest experience of politics weren't really that much these big events going on, end of apartheid, the Berlin Wall coming down. Actually, on a very local and mundane level, my dad was involved in local council politics, and he was the chair of the planning committee. So on a Saturday morning, he'd stick me and my sister in the back of the car, drive us around North London, and say, girls, you know, they want to pull down that building and build this. What do you think? You know, you're going to have to live with it longer than I am. I mean, you know, well, should we let them build this or build that? So, you know, at that very early age of sort of 5 or 6 years old, I was thinking that politics actually, literally had a concrete effect on people's lives. You could see it out there in bricks or mortar. And again, this is something that I think is a real irony, because you'll hear again and again, no, mosques and politics should have nothing to do with each other. Don't talk about politics in the mosque. We don't want to hear about politics. And yet, if you want to build a mosque, what do you have to do? Go and get planning permission from politicians. And you find actually increasingly the politics of Islamophobia affecting battles for over planning permissions for mosques. So, you know, that's sort of political background. Now, you know, later on, I studied to be a teacher at university, and as soon as you start looking at the education system and experiencing the education system, I'm sure anyone else who works, you know, in the NHS or any public service, you realise how much day to day what you're able to do with the kids in the classroom is affected by decisions that are being made by politicians. You can't get away from it. But still, at that point, I didn't actually get involved in any kind of politics. I wasted my student years as, you know, as your prime time for political activism, and that I just didn't get involved. But then, you know, I did become Muslim at university, and that was just a couple of years before a major event, which I'm sure has kind of affected the political consciousness that we all live with. Now, I remember when I went through quite a long process of reading about Islam and considering it, and when I was going through that process, at one point I was sitting in a lecture at university on equal opportunities and anti-discrimination, and it occurred to me, suddenly, if I do become Muslim, I'm going to be part of a minority group. And that was quite a kind of interesting idea for me, having grown up, you know, white, middle class, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. You know, the idea that I might be part of a group that's discriminated against in any way was not something I was very comfortable with. But nonetheless, I you know, got to the point where I knew Islam was what I believed in. And you know, it wasn't very long after that 9/11 happened. And again, the degree to which suddenly Muslims, Islam in general, were subject to this blanket accusation, so much of the media, so much opinion, these kind of cries of why are Muslims not coming out and condemning it? Because I'd always been able to assume that people took it for granted that I wasn't in favour of mass murder. And then suddenly, because I'm Muslim, I have to actually say, oh, by the way, before anything, I'm not in favour of killing 3,000 people in an office block in New York. I mean, it was something breathtaking to me to suddenly be put under that kind of suspicion and that kind of, you know, animosity, and so that be taken as normal. So, you know, I then became, you know, started just, I would look at the headlines or the opinion pieces in the papers, and they would just get me so riled up that this is how I'm being portrayed, this is how my religion is being portrayed. And I just started as an individual firing off emails of complaint and phone calls of complaint into the BBC, etc. But feeling like I can't get anywhere really on my own, just as one person. Now, obviously, then by a couple of years later, we had the Iraq War, and this was the first time that I really began to take political action. I got involved in the marches in the run-up to the war. It was the first time I ever wrote to my MP. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure some, you know, there's others who were there on that day when there was a 2 million man march through through London, you know, and there was that feeling of mass political action. You know, and I would definitely stand by. A lot of people have said to me over the years when I've been campaigning and trying to mobilise people, I went on the march, it didn't stop the war, politics doesn't work, there's no point. And I would claim that the whole Operation Shock and Awe, we're going to flatten Iraq, the politicians had to slightly kind of scale back the degree of destruction that was being planned because of the mass public outcry, but also that it's very much affected what politicians feel that they can do or they can get away with foreign policy-wise afterwards, that there was so much opposition. And if there hadn't been that opposition to the Iraq War, that quite probably they would have marched straight into Iran, straight into Syria directly afterwards, as people like George Bush were talking about, the whole axis of evil. However, no one can deny it didn't stop the war. The war was being pushed for, 10 years before by neocon think tanks in the States. You know, people who were in favour of these kind of policies were deeply involved in politics way before we were, a last-ditch attempt. And again, this was the first stage where I started to be shocked by the degree to which, the Muslim community didn't seem to be leading the way or even getting involved to a great extent in these things. And we're going to the Regent's Park Mosque, and and staff saying to me, we're having an event on this day. We should come. It's a really good course. You should attend. It's like, that's the date of the National March Against the War. It's like, not only have they, not got involved in trying to mobilise people to attend the march, they were trying to divert you away from actually doing that. I started to sort of dip my feet in, but this is the story of the event that really meant that, political activism that became so much part of what I've spent the last 10 years doing. I don't know how many of you know the story of Tom Handel, British student photojournalist, who he didn't just stop at I went on the march, I wrote to my MP. He joined the Human Shields project and flew to Iraq, and the idea, if you remember, was that internationals would go and act as human shields against the bombs. Now, he got there and found that the Saddam's authorities were kind of subverting that project, trying to send them to oil rigs and stuff rather than civilian areas. So he left Iraq before the war and went to join the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine. Now, the ISM there was organising internationals to do things like escorting Palestinian children past checkpoints to school, staying in houses that were under threat of demolition by Israeli bulldozers, monitoring checkpoints, being there as at present, exploiting the disgusting fact that if you're a white British citizen or an American citizen, your life seems to have more value in the eyes of the world than a Palestinian. So the Israelis are obviously going to be more reluctant to shoot you. However, the Israeli army and authorities were getting really frustrated with the ISM movement and the disruption they were causing to the occupation, the success they were having in protecting Palestinian communities. And 3 weeks before Tom was shot, Rachel Corrie, the American, was run over by a bulldozer in the most shocking, act of blatant murder, in front of the eyes of the world. But Tom nonetheless still went to Rafah, the same town where she'd been murdered, and in the morning of the day, the group had set out on an action to protect a house that was under threat of demolition on the border. And as they were out in the street, there started to be sniper fire from an Israeli sniper tower, and everybody fled the area apart from there was some very young children, kind of 5-6 years old, that froze in terror out in the open. And so Tom went out from behind the wall where they were sheltering to go and retrieve the children. He retrieved one child, went back for a little boy, and as he bent down to pick up the little boy, he was shot through the head by the Israeli sniper. And you know, this image of someone in Gaza having been shot, being carried along, it's something that we're all too familiar with from catastrophe to catastrophe over the years. But suddenly, here was this image, and here was someone that I knew as an 11-year-old boy, because he was the younger brother of a really good school friend of mine. So, you know, Tom was someone that I thought of as the kid who was kicking the football around when he went over to Sophie's house, and you know, as part of this family. And you know, suddenly this happened to my friend's little brother, and that's when you know, the human scale of what we see on the news. You know, this number of people killed. You know, this town bombed. These casualty numbers. It stopped being statistics for me, and it just totally bowled me over to think that these figures of 100,000 Iraqis killed. I was then seeing the effect that one, you know, person's brother, person's son has on that family. You know, the effect that it had on Tom's younger brother, who was 12 at the time. You know, what people went through as individuals. And you know, then realising that I didn't know these people in Iraq or Afghanistan or Palestine or so many different places where these things were happening. Chechnya, you know, you can look all around the world, and yet I could imagine and I could picture what was happening on a human scale. So, you know, from that point on, trying to change these things became, you know, very much what was the main thing in my life. I mean, I got involved with the Handel Families campaigns supporting what they were doing. They were an absolute inspiration, because nothing they did was going to bring Tom back. He was in a coma for 9 months before he died in hospital back in London. But you know, they realised he was out there. He'd gone out there to try to protect the human rights of the Palestinians, and you know, despite you know, going through their grief and they were going through his family, they dedicated themselves to a campaign for justice that was going to highlight the issues that Tom had been fighting for, and start to put some kind of chink in the way that the Israeli army could kill with absolute impunity. They were going to start to bring some kind of accountability, that if you murder someone, there is going to be justice. You know, their campaign was hugely reliant on getting a huge amount of media coverage, and they worked relentlessly to make sure they raised the Ersan story in the media, giving all those interviews. The day after Tom died, I went round with my friend Sophie Handel when she was going to give all the interviews to the TV studios, you know, starting at 6 o'clock in the morning, you know, taking a cab out to the White City, the BBC studios, going from interview to interview, you know, calling for legal justice, you know, highlighting what had happened, and it had a huge impact on people's awareness. People then realised that the Israeli army, you know, claims of ethics and, you know, humanitarian and we don't target civilians, was being blown to shots by the evidence that they were putting out there. And eventually, through that, the media pressure, the legal pressure, the political pressure they tried to put in trying to force the British government to do something to represent their citizen, eventually ended up in an Israeli soldier being prosecuted for shooting Tom. And that was an absolute first. That had not happened before. So, you know, that kind of catapulted me into campaigning, and I was very much looking for vehicles, you know, people to work with. And I came across MPAC at that point, back in 2003, in the summer after this happened. And the very first MPAC campaign I got involved in was an election campaign in Brent East. So, you know, when I talked to an MPAC member on the stall, this Islamic fair that I went to, he was telling me about some of the campaigns that they ran, and I said, this is the kind of organisation I thought Muslims needed. I just didn't know anyone had set it up yet. So straight away got involved, and having felt that sense of frustration and powerlessness, you know, going on the Iraq war marches and feeling how much difference we were making, suddenly then, when there was a by-election in the autumn, just after the Iraq war in Brent East, that was then an opportunity to make Tony Blair and the Labour Party pay for what they've done, pay politically, bring that accountability about that 2 million people marched and you didn't listen, but these people are voters. Now, Brent East has quite a large Muslim population, thousands of Muslim voters there, and so we went, the MPAC team, and the Labour politician who was running was pro-war, supported the party line, and the Liberal Democrats obviously had opposed the Iraq war. So we produced the leaflets, a simple message, you know, if you're against the Iraq war, then vote Labour out, vote for the anti-war Lib Dem candidate, send a message out there. And that was a massive ask, because as you can see, you know, the Lib Dems were coming from third place. It was a 10,000 vote swing that had to be achieved. But in a by-election, that's possible, you know, especially in times like that. And, you know, we produced thousands of leaflets. We got the electoral registers, you know, went through by hand. It takes hours to find all the Muslim names to say, right, we're going to go directly to the Muslim households. Our job as a Muslim organisation is we're going to be responsible for mobilising the Muslim vote. You know, 99% of the Muslim population, you know, was against the war. So if we don't use our votes that way, then what difference does it make? So it was, you know, hard work, and again, going outside the mosques, distributing the leaflets, the kind of upside down priorities we had, saying, well, you know, why are you sisters out on the street outside a mosque giving leaflets when, you know, where's your modesty and where's your this? And like, fine, okay, you want to give out the leaflets as enemy, fine, I can do something else. But there's a war that's happened, can we get that into proportion? You know, people who debate about anything or just taking action, but alhamdulillah, by 400 votes, the anti-war candidate, the Lib Dem, got elected, and it was seen across the press. They wrote it out. This is a backlash for the Iraq War, and the role of the Muslim vote in that was for the very first time acknowledged. And the Daily Telegraph did a lovely editorial about how MPAC had gotten involved and represented the black underside of British politics, because suddenly, if Muslims start voting as citizens, then that's very sinister. But for the first time, I felt we'd made a change, we'd made a difference. And this, you know, Sarah Tezo, as an MP, she was actually the youngest MP elected to Parliament, and she certainly was aware that an anti-war and a Muslim vote had helped to propel her into Parliament. And, you know, she followed that up in terms of the work that she did. She was a big campaigner on Guantanamo, and there was a British resident who was a constituent of hers in Guantanamo, and she did a huge amount campaigning to get him home and campaigning to close Guantanamo generally. So, and I don't believe that the pro-war Labour guy, if he got elected, would have done that work. But above all, it was that message it sent to other politicians. You don't listen to voters over this, these policies, you're going to lose your job. So, you know, that was one aspect, but so politics is certainly not just about MPs. Media is a huge thing, public opinion. So, you know, we got involved in the Kilroy Silk campaign. Simple case of media lobbying. He wrote an article in the Express, and so again, you've got to be a bit strategic about campaigns. The Express didn't have much reason to listen to us as sort of Muslim public. However, he was a high-profile BBC chat show host. They rely on licence fee payers' money. They've got a certain reputation to uphold. So we mobilised complaints to go in. Got in over 1,000 emails going into the BBC complaints department. We also went to the Commission for Racial Equality, as it was then, and said, "Hello, you've got nothing to say about this. This guy's, you know, promoting this kind of bigotry. He's got a long record of it." We did a dossier of all the other things he said about Muslims and other minorities. And eventually, sort of 10 days later, we even put out press releases, and that was the first time we did a TV interview on ITV News about this. Eventually, he had to go. He lost his job at the BBC. Again, accountability. You can't spread Islamophobia with no kind of comeback. A similar thing with a journalist we did at the Sunday Telegraph. He wrote a whole series entitled "The Black Heart of Islam," all kinds of choice quotes, unbelievable stuff. I mean, honestly, you know, if you just substituted the words black or Jewish in there rather than Muslim, no one would believe that people would publish this stuff in supposedly quality newspapers. But he was exposed as an employee of the British Council, again an organisation with a reputation to uphold. 2 months of campaigning it took. Initially he was suspended, got lots of complaints. You know, we used the internet, sticking their logo all over the place. Eventually, when we said, "Listen, you have a lot of centres in the Arab world. If you don't follow through on your own policies against bringing your organisation to disrepute by promoting racism and Islamophobia, then we're going to make sure this story is all over the, you know, Al Jazeera and every, you know, Arab media network that we can get." And sure enough, the next week he was fired from his job. So again, an end to impunity, a beginning of accountability. BBC case, the presenter described Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which we all know is under international law, not the case. Again, big campaign, having to escalate it up to the editorial complaints unit, resulted in a public apology and correction. Again, all these campaigns were run by, you know, for those of you who know Impact, we're not a professional organisation. We don't have the funding for offices, full-time staff, PR people. This was a 17-year-old student who was leading this campaign. People doing these things in their evenings and weekends. You know, who's got time to call up, like, you know, the news desk and follow through on this press release, like after their baby's nap or in their lunch hour, or, you know, on the go. But, you know, we started to have impact across the board. It's not just campaigns from media and politics. The police. There was a mosque up in East London that was getting targeted by EDL marches, weekly EDL marches. A couple of Muslim brothers who were beaten up in the street. One of them ended up in hospital with a broken jaw by these EDL marchers, just for walking down the street, being Muslim men with beards, and, you know, racist Islamophobic language used in that. And so we organised a mass petition to the local police to say, your policing of this has been totally inadequate. What guarantees, you know, you're going to give to the community? And a march of our own down to the police station, and eventually the local chief of police had to come out and apologise for their failures in policing and guarantee that they would put the necessary resources into protecting the mosque and the Muslim community there. Simple things, you know, sort of swimming pool up in Manchester, and some of the local team members there did a petitioning campaign when they decided to cancel all women-only swimming sessions. And they said, no, we're, you know, Muslim women who want women-only sessions, along with other women who want that, are paying their council tax. We'd like this, please reinstate it. And eventually, with enough people raising their voices, it got reinstated. The Boycott Israeli Goods campaign, actually the biggest success of the boycott campaigns that we've run, we initially targeted Israeli dates during Ramadan, because the irony is that thousands of Muslims up and down the country are breaking their fasts with Israeli dates that's going to fund the occupation and brutalisation of their brothers and sisters. So, you know, through leaflets, through posters, through information campaigns, targeting Muslim shops that refuse to stop stocking them with kind of public information, name and shame campaigns. We made that a high-profile issue, and the Israeli dates issue has now been picked up by dozens of organisations nationally, and that to me is a real success of campaigning, when you can have a domino effect, and you know, you then has a life of its own. Waterstones, again, you know, small local campaign. They were promoting Melanie Phillips' Londonistan book, and those of you who know Melanie Phillips know the kind of Islamophobia that she promotes. I mean, I don't think anyone would tolerate a book called, you know, Jew York, that was saying that Jews are taking over, and yet this was the message: Muslims are taking over London. This is the threat. Now, we knew that it wasn't realistic that we'd get them to stop stocking it or ban it or anything, because we've got to work around, you know, the starting point that we've got, and you're just going to be seen as a lot of nutcases who want to burn books and whatever. But we said, this is a very extreme, you know, viewpoint, and there's, you know, a lot of Muslim customers are going to be quite offended by this. What are you going to do to balance that when you're promoting this book? And, you know, we gave them a whole list of suggestions of books that would provide a more positive view of Muslims and more balanced information. So you should give these books equal prominence, you know, alongside and balance that out, and they agreed to that. So all kinds of local things that can happen. Again, with media, we've not just got to actually go in and complain or you know, thank the media and lobby from the outside. We have to start being a PR savvy community, putting out press releases, providing spokespeople, providing media opportunities. You know, I've shared some of the cynicism that people have that are just, you know, how far can you get with the mainstream media? But when the whole teddy bear hysteria, if you remember, happened with the teacher who was arrested in Sudan, and the images were people brandishing machetes saying "kill her" in Sudan. You know, this whole questioning of this is Muslims, this is Islam, and so we organised, you know, with the sister from Emma magazine, we got together very last minute, organised a demo outside the Sudanese embassy to say release her. And we tried to make this as media friendly as we could, so that we're going to be there with teddy bears and you know, posters, and we'll offer comments, etc. And we rang around to the news desk and said, you know, will you cover this? And I was just bowled over by what a positive response we got, how eager they were for that angle, that then, you know, meant instead of Muslims brandishing machetes, we had these pictures of Muslims brandishing teddy bears saying Melissa. We had the front page of the Sunday Times. We had pictures in you know, not only the Guardian, the Independent, but you know, Times and some of the tabloids, the BBC. It's sort of, you know, we got so much coverage for what was a very small demo, because getting Muslims to come out last minute for something like that was not an easy job, but showed you can rarely make a difference, because again, you know, getting feedback from non-Muslims I knew, my work and my family and around, the impact that coverage like that has on people's perceptions, because otherwise people don't know. You know, if you believe everything you read in the media, and that is the main source of information for most non-Muslims about you and me, then I would be scared. You know, I would feel threatened, I would be worried, and we can really change things if we're proactive. Again, the election campaigns, just like in Renties, at the 2005 election, again, accountability for the Iraq War, again in 2010, MPs who had made Islamophobic remarks in the media, MPs who were part of the leaders of the Friends of Israel lobbies, MPs who voted for the Iraq War, MPs who had voted for 28 days detention without charge, which we all know the people that were going to get locked up were going to be Muslims under those kind of laws. It's our civil rights that were under attack. And 2005 was the first time that we managed to mobilise a Muslim vote to kick out a sitting MP. Lorna Fitzsimon's up in Rochdale, prominent member of Labour Friends of Israel, lost by a few hundred votes. If you want to know more about that campaign, there was a Channel 4 documentary that followed our activists up in the north of England, called Operation Muslim Vote. You can catch it on YouTube. Real eye-opener, and showed politics, like everyday people on the street talking about these things, leaflets going out. So, and then 2010 there was four different constituencies, marginal constituencies, where there was enough Muslims to swing the vote, and again, 4 cases we removed sitting MPs due to our campaigns, and I can tell you it does have an impact, because 2010 we didn't have to go back to Rochdale to campaign there, because guess what, after Lorna was kicked out for supporting Israel, we found that both the Lib Dem and the Labour candidates who were competing for the seat went out of their way to say what they would do on Palestine, to talk about issues like Islamophobia, to win the Muslim vote on issues, as distinct from what we've seen for generations of them. Politicians, they can go around and say, have a nice cup of tea with me, have a photo, and we'll help with visas, and we'll ignore you on everything else. So that's the history of campaigning. Just a few. I know I've got limited. How are we doing on time? Cool, excellent. So that's some of the campaigns I've been involved in. Obviously, there's a lot more over the years, and it's all been a huge learning process. I have no training in public affairs or PR or any of these things. The first, we've always tried to put press releases out and offer spokespeople to the media when these kind of stories or hysteria erupts about media. I mean, most recently it was niqab, niqab in the courtroom, the niqab ban law, doctors wearing niqab, gender segregation, all these stories. We've put out press releases and said we can come and talk on them, and then eventually the media start coming to you. When I first had to go in and do a TV studio interview, I'm a nursery teacher. What kind of throwing myself in the deep end is this? I was debating against this, I can't remember her name now, but this MP who was quite a big part of again, pro-Israel lobby in Parliament, very anti-Muslim. It was about when Karadari was due to visit, and there was a whole controversy about should he be banned or not. And I really felt on the back foot that I wasn't familiar with these things. But it's been a kind of learning process as we go. You kind of realise how you can go into a studio. The niqab law ban. I got to do a BBC debate against Philip Holloway, the Tory MP who's bringing the private members bill. And actually, all of these things are arguments that are so easy for us to make in a way that the public will buy into. You know, I said to him, Libby, you rarely want police time and resources arresting women because of what they're wearing rather than dealing with violent crime and burglary and real problems. And of course he didn't have a direct answer to that. I said, you know, do we want men in Parliament and the police telling women what they can and can't wear in a free country? These are simple arguments, but we're not out there making them. When we've run around TV studios, you know, they're not used to proactive calls from Muslim organisations. They're not used to being able to find spokespeople that easily. We're getting better as a community, you know, since we started, but we are light years behind. And one illustration is, you know, if you want to see how political and media activism should be done in an effective way, just look at the pro-Israel lobby. Just look at the fact that, you know, in the States, any politician who wants to get anywhere has to show up and pay homage at the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, has to say the right thing, because of the effectiveness of what they're doing. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's something that's documented by, if you read a book like The Israel Lobby by Professors Moshe and Walt at Harvard University, the way that political donations are used, the way that different spheres of influence are used. The same thing happens in Britain. Journalist Philip Oborne did a brilliant report and documentary on Channel 4 a few years on Britain's Israel lobby. If you see what are the number one destinations for MPs to visit, Israel comes at the top of that list. Why? Because there are organisations like the Friends of Israel groups, like BICOM, that are paying and arranging trips for MPs to go there, that are pressurising them to take those opportunities, that it's seen as a step up the political ladder. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The same strategies that are being used to oppress people and to you know, maintain Israel's position can be used on behalf of justice, can be used on behalf of the Palestinians, can be used on behalf of, you know, a global struggle for human rights across our Ummah and across humanity. So, and it's obviously not just you know, the Zionists who we've seen using politics. There's so many examples we see around us. You know, I love you know, looking at examples like the Gurkha Justice Campaign, the way, you know, Joanna Lumley and a bunch of campaigners had the Minister for Immigration sort of there, sort of simpering in front of Ms Lumley saying, and you will do this and you will do that, and guess what, he ended up having to agree to it all. And they even had the Daily Mail calling for, we must let these immigrants in. You know, it was like, this can get massive change. Another one is the phone hacking scandal and Lieberson and everything that's happened out of there. You know, it wasn't just celebrities going to the courts. The News of the World ended up closing down largely because of a huge public backlash that was one of the main starting points of it, when they revealed that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked, the murdered teenager. There was a campaign started up by people on Mumsnet saying, you know, here's the numbers of the News of the World's main advertisers. Everybody needs to email them, call them and ask them to withdraw their advertising. And, you know, within a week, they had, you know, thousands and thousands of calls going in. The advertisers started to be pulled. Murdoch pulled the plug on this paper. People power, especially now in the age of social media and internet, you don't have to look hard to see it working. It works. So then you've got to see, you know, no one should see themselves on their own in this. There's you know, the people who are making the decisions in politics, in media, in government, in business, whatever positions of power. And there are a lot of organisations that are influencing those in what I would argue is a very negative way. way. You know, if you look at something like the gender segregation row that we had, that originated with the Henry Jackson Society, a right-wing, self-professed neocon think tank with someone like Douglas Murray behind it, who set up a group called Students' Rights, which actually didn't have any students in it, but was simply about trying to kick up a fuss against political Muslim groups and pro-Palestinian groups on campus, and were hugely successful at it. But the question is, why are our community on the other side not doing these things in the same way? Because the biggest thing that has hit me in the face again and again, and that we as an organisation of Impact have come across, is how hard it is to mobilise Muslims to mass action. You know, if you look at an example, the campaign, the petition to free the brothers from Guantanamo, it needed 100,000 signatures to be debated in Parliament, and eventually, after more than a year of activists working their guts out to get those signatures, they got those 100,000 signatures. Now, even discarding the non-Muslims who supported that campaign, how many Muslims are there in this country? Many more than 3 million. So proportionally, that's actually quite a small proportion that needed to sign that simple thing for human rights. There's over 3,000 mosques in this country. I think we did the math that if every mosque in the country had collected just 60 signatures on a Jummah, then those 100,000 signatures could have been collected in 1 week, rather than one year of going around. We are asleep as a community. We're beginning to wake up, but we are way behind the curve of where we need to be. It's very interesting. I went to the big Global Peace and Unity conference to work on the impact stall there a couple of months ago, and I've done those big conferences giving out leaflets about these political issues, about helping the oppressed, about the Ummah, and there was a tangible change in what I noticed about the Muslim public reaction to these issues. You know, back sort of 6-7 years ago when I first did a conference like that, and you're handing out leaflets to people, and I just always would come home at the end of the weekend just unbelievably frustrated. Like, what is wrong with people? You know, we're calling ourselves Muslims, and there's just this, people are not interested, they do not care. And it was the beginning of people saying, oh yeah, you know, we need to do something, this is good, this is, you know, I want to be part of this, I am part of this. Just the beginnings of that. So I am optimistic. But I think it goes much deeper. You know, we can all see what's happening around the world, and particularly to the Muslim Ummah. And we can see that these issues, they all come back at their root to political causes, and therefore political solutions if we are going to change things. So, but the vast majority of our Muslim community has two solutions best to this reality of, like, make dua for them. Well, if you want a job, are you going to just make dua? Or are you going to fill out the application, do the work, do what you can on a practical basis, and then make dua that your efforts are successful? You know, in the Quran, when God says to us, you know, what is wrong with you that you do not fight in the way of those, you know, men, women and children who cry out, send from you protectors. You know, those people saying to God, send us people who will protect us. Send us protectors, not God come down and do a miracle on earth and protect us, you know, with some supernatural thing. This is our job. And again, but yeah, you know, we have Gaza happening, and again, you know, East London Mosque, instead of organising, you know, political actions, they organised a night when everyone was going to come and pray for people in Gaza. Now, if I was in Gaza, I would want those people who are British citizens, therefore have access to power and influence that most of the Muslim Ummah would dream of. We're in the centre of geopolitical power. I wouldn't want them just to sit in their mosque all night, pray, and then go home and think, I did my good deed. That's it. I'd want them to be out, campaigning for their MPs to do something now. I'd want them to be out making the boycott work. I'd want them to be building institutions that would rival the pro-Israel lobby, on the media, making this known to the entire British public, the reality of what was happening. Again, charity appeals. And charity has its place in emergency humanitarian aid. But again, if I was in Palestine, I wouldn't just charity to rebuild another hospital after it's been demolished, to treat those who've already been bombed, already been injured, to support those orphans who've already been made orphans. I would want political action that would prevent those things happening and reoccurring and reoccurring and reoccurring. Again, we have crazy crackpot solutions like Hizb ut-Tahrir, and they're staying out of politics, and when Gaza happened they organised a demo outside the Egyptian embassy to say send in the army. Well, guess what? Who's funding the Egyptian army? American aid is funding the same army as funding Israel. You think that's going to work? And let's not just wait for Khilafah before we save anybody's life. So we've got a real lack of solutions going on. Again, we've got, the world has been turned upside down. You saw those pictures of, Muslim women in France being harassed for what they wear, what's happening in Palestine, what's happened, I just saw the Muslim news headline, Central African Republic, Muslims, burned and killed and all kinds of violence happening, the Rohingya Muslims. Anywhere you look in the world, in China, find me a Muslim population that's not suffering some kind of oppression. I would argue we as a people are one of the most oppressed people on earth, and yet this is not the image. We're not image of Muslims as victims. We are the oppressors, the aggressors, the violent ones. And we don't understand the power of these narratives and the way that we've got to reclaim and fight in a way that that will protect basic human rights. How many people here have heard of Auschwitz? Everybody, I'm sure, and quite right that we have. It's something that should never ever be forgotten. But how many people have heard of Amaska? See, that was another concentration camp. The pictures on the right are from Amaska, where Bosnian Muslims were murdered, were starved, were treated and exterminated in a genocide after the world had said never again. And yet, they haven't even been commemorated. MPAC started a campaign called Stop Islamophobia Week, which centred around commemorating the anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, the biggest single massacre of Bosnian Muslims. We're talking less than 20 years ago, we're talking our lifetimes, we're talking less than a 2-hour flight from London. We're talking about Muslims who it wasn't because of the colour of their skin, it wasn't because they spoke a different language, it was simply because they were Muslim. And that genocide, if you actually look back at the history of it and the anti-Muslim propaganda that was put out by the Serb extremists, by Milosevic and his political forces, the kind of arguments they used to whip up fear and hatred of Muslims were scarily similar to what you'll hear people saying about Muslims in the UK today. They said that the Muslims are not European, they can never be European, they can never be integrated, they are backward, they are part of a kind of Eastern bloc and conspiracy, they're Ottomans, they're foreigners, they are culturally a threat. They dragged up kind of history in the same way that we see the imagery of the Crusades reoccurring. So, unless we turn this narrative around and point out that we as Muslims are victims here with human rights and reclaim those ourselves, because politics much more than just the actions and the, yeah, lovely, and the nitty-gritty of it. We have to have a political movement which can learn from great political movements like the civil rights, black civil rights movement, where, you know, first they reclaimed their story, they reclaimed their history, they reclaimed their personhood, you know, as an oppressed people with rights, and stop. You know, if you listen to people like Malcolm X, he was saying, you know, black people in America should stop being on the back foot. They should stop being apologetic. You know, he would talk about, you know, house Negroes, you know, versus field Negroes. This idea of kind of Uncle Tom mindset, or a kind of apologetic mindset. And I think this is something that, you know, that we can begin to see with Muslims here, that there's so much pressure to apologise, to distance yourself, to be, you know, I'm Muslim, but I'm a moderate Muslim. No, you've done nothing wrong. You have nothing to apologise for, and in fact, you know, you, as a Muslim, deserve apologies for what is happening to Muslims in this country and to Muslims around the world. And again, we've got to start appealing in universal terms. This is about justice. This is about human rights. You know, this is not about just saying, you know, Muslim rights, or God gave us his rights, or, you know, yes, we believe that, but this is something that every human being can empathise with. And we don't talk in universal terms. Again, the huge mental block we have in terms of the Muslim mindset, the way that we see our religion, we have stopped seeing justice as being the centre of it. You know, there's so many quotes from the Quran, so many hadith one can quote that shows how central justice, and if you see a wrong, change it. Let him change it with his hand. You know, if he cannot, then he was down. If he cannot, then with his heart. And this is the weakest of faith. You know, no one can argue that we're seeing wrongs and that we have the ability to change them in practical ways with our hands. You know, again, priorities within religion. This is something, when we start talking about that, it's an impact, this is often misunderstood. People get offended, people get upset. Are you belittling the Sunnah? Are you belittling prayer? No, we're saying that Islam is a complete and balanced way of life. And there's a quote from Sheikh Kardari I'd like to give you to illustrate this, is that he said that among the Muslims today there is a great violation of the Islamic order of priorities, and that this takes place amongst those who are known to be practicing Muslims. This terrible disorder has afflicted our ummah so that the unimportant is now preferred over the important, and the small is magnified and the significant is belittled. Because Islam gives us an order of priority, and the protection of human life is right up there, where, you know, the blood of a Muslim is said to be more precious, more sacred than the Kaaba itself. And Kardari actually said in his book, he was asked, you know, if people had to choose between, you know, spending money on going on Hajj or going on Umrah, and spending it on protecting human life, then nobody should be going even on Hajj. He said he felt that current circumstances it should be possible to do both. But he was saying, why are people spending money going on Umrah that they could spend on saving human lives, and yet we think we're pleasing God in that? Because God has not given us those priorities. He's not said do extra rituals, extra prayer, extra fasts, and Islamic dress. Let's imitate the way that the Prophet dressed, the way he cut his nails, which foot he walked into the bathroom with, and forget that this was a man who spent his life fighting for justice, fighting for the oppressed, working in practical ways. So, you know, we've got to understand the mental, the mindset that we've got to change in our community. We have to spread that message throughout the community, and then it's a question of mobilising people to have a mass movement of all different kinds. Everybody has different contributions to make, all kinds of different campaigning but we must do it in a way that is organised, that is networked, that's plugged into to groups and to networks, because one person on their own is isolated, can't achieve much. But as soon as we're networked, and now we live in this interconnected internet world, these things can happen in such a big way. And again, that's the Islamic way to do things. You know, when it talks, when the Quran talks about you know, fighting the cause of Allah, it says in ranks, in rows, you know, organised in that way. But you know, again, this is something that I would argue none of us can stay out of. We all have different contributions to make, but none of us as Muslims or as human beings with a conscience can remain inactive when it comes to changing the world for the better. And you know, again, this is the reality that's happening today, and this is what means that I can't, much as I would like sometimes, to not have anything to do with campaigning, political action, and just lead a quiet life. I mean, it can be an amazing thing to be part of. It can, you know, I've met some amazing people. Some of the campaigning experience handler, you know, it's not like in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, when people were stuck in a trench and risking their lives out there. We can fight to defend our brothers and sisters from the comfort of our living rooms in front of our computers. But we can't forget that this is not just behind the TV screens, this is reality. And I was, a few weeks ago, I was wrapping up at a screening of a documentary called Dirty Wars, which I definitely recommend everybody gets online and watches, as journalist Jeremy Scarhill, because he, and it was covering the drone attacks in Afghanistan, and I interviewed this little girl, and she was explaining, you know, had subtitles, but they killed my grandfather, my uncle, my cousin, you know, had her talking about this, and she looked the spitting image of my daughter. This is my little girl Amani, home. She's 2 years old, and you know, see this child, and my friend at the end said to me that little girl really looked like Amani, and just remember, you know, these people are our brothers and sisters as much as our own family are, and what we would want if these things happen to our own family, you know, we wouldn't rest, we wouldn't make excuses, and there's always excuses, but yeah, going back to this great man, this was a quote from an interview he gave, I think on his 94th birthday, and he was asked, you know, are you not going to retire? He's saying, you know, when there are these problems in the world, and you have the ability to bring about some kind of change, some kind of peace, you can't say no. So if being 94 and having spent 27 years of your life already in prison wasn't an excuse to not get involved, then I don't know what is. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it to Zishan.